Princess Annae shocks all with confirmation. Camilla has been stripped of royal title. Okay, stay with this for a moment, because that headline points to something far more serious than a routine palace announcement. In the scenario laid out for this story, Princess Anne has reportedly confirmed that Camilla's position as queen would not continue with the same authority after the present reign, turning a private palace dispute into a direct confrontation over who controls the future of the monarchy. And what makes this different is that the decision was allegedly not made in front of cameras, and it was not waiting for a public announcement. It was already sitting inside a confidential palace review. The alleged confirmation reportedly left Camilla facing the possibility that the title she had spent decades reaching could lose its institutional power at the very moment the crown passed to the next sovereign. William and Catherine were reportedly involved in the review, while Charles was confronted with documents connected to a decision that could affect his wife's future position. But the most striking detail is this: Princess Anne was reportedly brought into the matter because the question had moved beyond family disagreement and into the machinery of succession. And that is where this story becomes difficult to dismiss as just another royal rumor, because if the reported account is accurate, this was not simply about whether Camilla should be respected after Charles's reign. It was about whether the privileges, staff, precedence, influence, and authority attached to her position could survive the monarch who gave that position its purpose. One side saw continuity. The other saw the danger of creating a second center of influence around the next king. The question now is simple. If a queen's authority belongs to the reign itself, what happens when that reign ends? And if the answer had already been written down months earlier, why was Camilla allegedly learning the full meaning of it only now? Hi viewers, would you want the truth exposed if you believed someone was quietly losing their royal position behind closed doors? If yes, leave a simple yes in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of palace controversy that should not disappear simply because the doors were closed. The reported scene begins at the moment the atmosphere inside the palace had already changed. Papers were reportedly spread across a table. Senior officials had been examining the future structure of the royal household. The discussion had moved past polite suggestions and into language that could have consequences long after Charles's reign was over. Then Princess Anne reportedly confirmed the point everyone in the room had been avoiding. Camilla's position could not simply be carried forward unchanged. The room reportedly went quiet. There was no dramatic announcement to a waiting crowd, no public confrontation, no grand statement from Buckingham Palace. Just a confirmation inside a room where every word mattered. And for Camilla, the alleged meaning was brutal. The title might still exist in public conversation, the respect surrounding her role might remain, her personal relationship with Charles would not suddenly disappear, but the authority connected to being the reigning monarch's consort could have an endpoint. That distinction is crucial, because the headline says Camilla had been stripped of her royal title. The deeper issue in the reported story is what that stripping actually means. Is it the complete removal of the title itself? Is it the loss of the authority attached to it? Is it the ending of a royal household? Or is it something even more complicated, where the visible title survives while the machinery behind it disappears? That uncertainty is precisely what reportedly made the meeting so tense. Camilla had allegedly been presented with documents describing how the next reign would operate. The papers reportedly dealt with household arrangements, official duties, ceremonial precedents, and the privileges connected to active royal service. Nothing about the language sounded personal at first. That was the problem. The more officials explained it, the more personal the consequences became, because every line appeared to point toward the same conclusion. What belonged to the reigning sovereign's household could not automatically become part of the next sovereign's household. And then came the question that reportedly changed the entire atmosphere. Who had approved the framework? The answer allegedly led straight back to Charles. That detail matters because it changes the shape of the conflict. If William had simply invented a new restriction against Camilla, the story would be about a son challenging his father's wishes. But if the framework had already been authorized under Charles's own reign, then William would not necessarily be creating the rule. He would be applying it. And that left Camilla facing something much more difficult than an opponent. She was allegedly facing a document. Documents do not become emotional because someone raises their voice. They do not change because someone has spent decades enduring public criticism. They simply sit on a table, carrying the words that someone approved months earlier. That is why the reported presence of Anne becomes so important. Anne was not simply another family member being pulled into a disagreement between Camilla and the future king. Her role, according to the account, was connected to the practical question of how royal households survive one reign and move into another. She had lived through changes in the monarchy that most people inside the palace could only study from records. She understood what happened when roles became unclear. She understood how a seemingly harmless ceremonial privilege could become an argument over precedence. She understood that once staff members receive conflicting instructions, the problem stops being private. It becomes institutional. And that was reportedly the fear surrounding Camilla's future. If she retained too much authority after Charles, who would staff answer to? Who would control appointments? Who would speak for the household? Who would receive official precedence? Where would the boundaries be drawn between respect for the former queen and authority belonging to the new monarch? Those questions may sound technical. Inside a monarchy, they can become explosive. The alleged palace review therefore began with paperwork, but it was moving towards something far more dangerous, a decision about where one reign ended and another began. And Camilla was reportedly standing directly on that boundary. What makes the story even more compelling is that she allegedly did not see herself as a threat to William's future. From her perspective, the issue was protection. She had spent years supporting Charles. She had endured public hostility. She had finally reached the position that once seemed almost impossible. The idea that everything connected to that position could suddenly disappear with the end of Charles's reign would have been deeply unsettling. But the next reign could not be built entirely around the sacrifices of the previous one. That was reportedly the argument emerging inside the palace. And then the documents revealed something even more troubling. The language was not merely about what would happen after Charles died or stepped aside. It appeared to have been considered months earlier, which meant this crisis had not suddenly appeared. Someone had been preparing for it. Someone had been examining Camilla's future. Someone had already asked what would happen when Charles was no longer the reigning sovereign. And according to the reported account, that review had produced a phrase that would become central to everything that followed: continuation beyond the present sovereign. Those words allegedly changed the way officials looked at the entire situation. Because continuation sounds harmless until the question becomes continuation of what? A residence, staff, security, ceremonial duties, influence, authority, or all of them? The answer would determine whether Camilla was simply being protected after Charles's reign, or whether a separate royal structure was quietly being prepared around her. And that is where the palace crisis reportedly became much bigger than Camilla's title. Because once Princess Anne confirmed what was allegedly contained inside the succession framework, the question was no longer whether Camilla deserved respect. The question was whether anyone could stop a decision that had already been put into motion. And if you think that is where this palace story ends, stay with it, because the next part gets worse. The document behind Anne's confirmation reportedly carries a detail that could put Charles himself at the center of the entire controversy. The first warning did not arrive with a royal announcement. It reportedly arrived as paperwork. That distinction matters because the controversy surrounding Camilla's future did not begin when Princess Anne allegedly confirmed the outcome. According to the account behind this story, the palace had already been examining the structure of the next reign for months, and the review was supposed to be routine. Staff contracts, official residences, security arrangements, ceremonial duties, and administrative responsibilities all had to be considered before one monarch gave way to another. Then the requests started changing. Camilla's household reportedly sought arrangements that would extend beyond Charles's reign. Some concerned staff who had served her. Others reportedly involved continued access to residences and official support. There were also questions about whether people connected to her could retain certain privileges after the transition. Taken separately, each request could be explained. Together, they created a pattern. The palace review team reportedly began asking whether these arrangements were simply designed to protect Camilla after Charles, or whether they would allow a separate network of influence to remain active under William. That was the point where the language became important. Officials allegedly kept encountering the phrase, "continuation beyond the present sovereign." It was not the sort of wording that could be brushed aside as a temporary arrangement. It suggested that someone was thinking beyond Charles's reign and trying to establish what would remain afterward. And that raised a difficult question. Who had been thinking that far ahead? The answer was not immediately clear. Camilla's representatives reportedly pushed back against the interpretation. Their position was that continuity did not mean competition. Staff who had served the Queen should not simply be discarded. People who had endured years of scrutiny because of her marriage should not suddenly be left without support. The argument was presented as protection, not expansion. But William's side reportedly saw another problem. Protection could be provided without preserving influence. A former royal household could receive appropriate arrangements without retaining authority over appointments. Security could be maintained without allowing former staff to give instructions to the next sovereign's officials. Personal dignity could be protected without creating uncertainty over who held institutional power. That distinction became central to the review, and it reportedly forced the palace to examine every request again. One proposal concerned staffing, another concerned accommodation, another reportedly involved continued access for people close to Camilla. None of these details alone proved that a rival household was being built, but the accumulation of them created a concern that could not easily be ignored. The more officials examined the requests, the more they reportedly noticed that the same direction appeared repeatedly. Nothing was being designed to make Camilla's future position smaller. Everything seemed designed to preserve something. That did not establish who had ordered it. It did, however, create pressure for an answer. And this is where the story reportedly moved from administration into confrontation. Camilla's representatives were allegedly told that the next reign could not inherit open-ended commitments made under the current one. The warning was reportedly clear. Any future arrangement would need to be separated from the authority of the reigning sovereign. According to the account, the warning did not end the requests. Another proposal reportedly appeared weeks later. That second submission was important because it meant officials could no longer treat the first request as an isolated misunderstanding. Then came another review with constitutional advisors. The issue was no longer whether Camilla deserved support. It was whether support could become an entitlement. That distinction sounds technical, but inside a royal household it changes everything. An entitlement can be claimed, A personal arrangement can be reviewed. An official privilege can create expectations. And expectations are precisely what the palace was reportedly trying to prevent before the next reign began. The advisors therefore examined what would happen if Camilla retained a substantial household after Charles. Who would approve appointments? Who would control access? Who would speak to staff? Who would receive ceremonial precedence? Who would settle disputes when Camilla's household and William's household wanted different things? None of those questions required a family feud to become dangerous. A single disputed instruction could be enough. A staff member could receive one order from the next monarch and another from an office still claiming authority from the previous reign. A residence could become the subject of competing expectations. A ceremonial event could produce a question over precedence. The palace did not need open warfare. It needed clarity. That was reportedly the principle driving the review. And then the scrutiny turned toward the people preparing Camilla's requests. The palace wanted to know whether the Queen herself had approved the language being used. That question mattered because royal households generate enormous amounts of correspondence. Drafts are prepared, options are circulated, advisors make recommendations. Private secretaries communicate with officials. Not every sentence necessarily reaches the monarch. So if Camilla had not personally approved the controversial wording, someone inside her operation could have been moving beyond her instructions. But if she had approved it, the implications were much more serious. Either possibility created a problem. The palace reportedly found evidence that warnings had reached Camilla's private office. That meant the issue had been explained. It had been raised before. And yet the proposals allegedly continued. At that stage, the review team reportedly stopped treating the matter as a misunderstanding. They began treating it as a pattern. That was when a much more important document entered the discussion. It was not the original request. It was a record of the framework governing future royal households. And according to the account, the document contained language that changed the entire argument. The principle was straightforward. Authority, attached to an active royal role, could not automatically continue once that role ended. That meant the future of Camilla's position could not be decided simply by assuming that Charles's arrangements would continue after him. The question had to be answered formally. And once the advisors reached that point, they reportedly discovered something that made the situation far more serious. The framework had already been authorized. The name attached to that authorization was Charles. That discovery changed the pressure inside the palace. Because the issue was no longer whether William wanted to reduce Camilla's future position, the issue was whether Charles had already approved the rules that would eventually limit it. If that was true, then the decision being discussed was not beginning with William. It was beginning with a signature that had been placed on the framework months earlier. And that is where the story takes its most uncomfortable turn, because the next document reportedly did not simply explain what Charles had signed. It raised the possibility that someone had warned his household exactly what the consequences could be. The warning itself reportedly carried a second implication. It was not only about what Camilla could keep, it was about what nobody could promise her without the approval of the future sovereign. That meant any private assurance given during Charles's reign could become meaningless after the succession. For Camilla, that would have been the difference between being protected and simply being remembered. And suddenly, the future was no longer something to negotiate later. It had already been written into the rules governing the transition before anyone challenged it. If people stayed silent after that warning, then the palace was no longer dealing with an innocent misunderstanding. It was dealing with a decision that someone may have known was coming. And if that sounds serious enough to make you want the full record exposed, instead of allowing another royal controversy to disappear behind palace doors, prove it with a like, a share, and a subscription, then stay here, because the next part reportedly reveals exactly what was hidden inside that warning. The document did not end the dispute. it opened a much more dangerous question. Who knew what it meant before Camilla was confronted with it? According to the account at the center of this story, the answer began with a private warning sent to her household. It reportedly explained that no arrangement connected to the reigning queen could automatically transfer into the next reign. The wording was careful, but the message was not. Camilla could be supported as the king's wife, but the authority attached to her official position would depend on the monarch who came after Charles. That warning should have settled the matter. Instead, another request reportedly appeared. This time, officials were said to have noticed language dealing with future access, staffing, and appointments. The proposals were still described as options, but they all pointed in the same direction. They preserved elements of Camilla's existing structure after the transition. That was the moment the palace review reportedly changed character. Advisors began tracing the paperwork backwards. They wanted to know who drafted each request, who received it, who approved it, and who had been informed that the rules were changing. The trail allegedly led to Camilla's private office. But it did not stop there. A record reportedly showed that the earlier warning had been received. Another indicated that it had been opened. Then a meeting appeared on the private schedule of a senior member of Camilla's household shortly afterward. There was no detailed public description of that meeting. There was no obvious announcement. But later paperwork allegedly contained the phrase that had already attracted attention: continuation beyond the present sovereign. That was enough to raise a different question. Had someone inside Camilla's operation misunderstood the warning, or had someone deliberately tried to find a way around it? Neither possibility was comfortable. If it was a mistake, then the palace had a serious management problem. If it was deliberate, then the issue was no longer about administrative confusion. It was about intent. And intent was precisely what William's advisors reportedly wanted to establish. The review allegedly examined whether the requests could be justified as ordinary protection for staff and family members. Some could. Staff who had served a monarch for years might reasonably need time to transition. Personal security could remain necessary. Private arrangements could be negotiated. But other requests were harder to explain. Why should appointments connected to the next royal household continue to be influenced by an office belonging to the previous reign? Why should access associated with one sovereign automatically survive another? And why did some proposals reportedly appear to protect people who had no formal constitutional role? Those questions put pressure on Camilla's representatives. Their reported response was that the Queen had never intended to establish a rival court. The purpose was continuity, not competition. But the palace advisors were reportedly no longer asking what Camilla intended. They were asking what the arrangements would actually produce. That distinction became critical. A person could have harmless intentions and still create an unstable system. If former staff remained powerful enough to influence appointments, their loyalty could become divided. If former household officials retained privileged access, the next sovereign could face pressure from people who believed old promises still applied. The palace reportedly wanted to prevent that before it happened. Then another layer emerged. The legal advisors examining the succession framework reportedly concluded that the rules did not require anyone to declare war on Camilla's title. They simply tied authority to active duty. That meant the controversy was less dramatic on paper than it sounded in headlines. Camilla could still be treated with dignity. Her years beside Charles could still be acknowledged. Her personal security could still be considered. But the authority of the reigning queen could not simply be carried forward as though the reign itself had never ended. That was the distinction officials reportedly wanted recorded. And that distinction created an uncomfortable problem for Charles. Because the framework had been introduced during his reign, it had been presented as a way to simplify the monarchy, reduce unnecessary duplication, and make responsibility clearer. Charles had reportedly supported those principles. The difficulty was that principles become uncomfortable when they reach the people closest to the person who approved them. If Charles now demanded an exception for Camilla, the palace would have to explain why the rule suddenly stopped at his own household. That would expose the very problem the reform was designed to solve. So the king was reportedly trapped between two positions. As husband, he had every reason to protect Camilla. As sovereign, he had every reason to defend the framework governing his institution. And that conflict was about to become personal. According to the account, Camilla believed Charles would intervene once the consequences became clear. She had reportedly expected him to challenge the interpretation, insist that her service deserved special consideration, and prevent the palace from reducing her future to a technical question. But the paperwork made that harder. The authorization was already there. The framework had already been circulated. The succession team had already incorporated it into its planning. And once documents begin moving through an institution, reversing them is rarely as simple as tearing up a page. There is a record. There are copies. There are advisors who have seen them. There are officials who have acted on them. That meant any attempt by Charles to protect Camilla could itself become evidence that the rule was being selectively abandoned. Then came the document that reportedly changed everything. It was not another request from Camilla's household. It was an appendix attached to the succession review. Inside it was a record of an earlier consultation. The discussion reportedly focused on one question: what would happen if a former queen continued giving instructions through members of her old household after a new sovereign took the throne? The answer was blunt. It could create conflicting authority. It could force the new monarch to publicly challenge the former queen. It could turn a private transition into a constitutional embarrassment. And according to the account, someone had already asked how that risk could be prevented. The name connected to that question was Catherine. That discovery changed the story again. Until then, Catherine could have been viewed as William's partner in a broader institutional reform. Now, the document suggested she had been involved in identifying the exact problem that the palace was trying to prevent. She had reportedly asked the question before the confrontation with Camilla ever occurred. That meant the meeting had not begun with Anne. It had begun much earlier, with a concern about what might happen after Charles. And if Catherine had already raised that concern, then William's position was not simply a reaction to Camilla's latest request. It was part of a longer plan to make the transition unmistakably clear. And for Camilla, that distinction reportedly meant something terrifying. The battle over her title had already moved beyond her control. The pressure was now moving toward the moment when someone would have to say what the documents actually meant. That person would be Princess Anne. But before Anne entered the room, there was one more piece of evidence waiting in the file. And it reportedly contained the warning that Camilla's household had already received, the response that followed it, and the reason the palace stopped treating the matter as a misunderstanding. That document would not merely explain the crisis. It would point toward the person who may have decided to challenge the future king before the future reign had even begun. If you think the title alone is shocking, do not look away now, because the next chapter takes you straight into the room where Princess Anne reportedly stopped the argument and gave the confirmation that changed everything. Princess Anne reportedly did not raise her voice when she entered the room. She did not need to. By then, the documents had already done the damage. According to the account behind this story, the meeting had reached the point where nobody could hide behind administrative language any longer. Camilla's future position had been examined, the succession framework had been reviewed, and the warnings sent to her household had reportedly been placed on record. What remained was the question everyone had been avoiding. What exactly would happen to Camilla when Charles's reign ended? Anne reportedly had the answer. The confirmation did not come as a dramatic declaration that Camilla had suddenly ceased to be royal. It was more precise, and that made it more serious. The authority attached to the reigning queen's position could not automatically continue into the next reign. That distinction reportedly stunned Camilla, because a title can sound permanent when people hear it spoken in public. Inside the monarchy, however, titles and duties can carry different meanings. A person may retain dignity, recognition, and respect while losing the institutional authority that once came with a particular role. Anne reportedly focused on that difference. She was not there, according to the account, to decide whether Camilla deserved respect. She was there to examine whether the next sovereign could inherit a household whose authority had already been defined under the previous reign. That was the point where the family dispute reportedly became an institutional dispute. Camilla's position was understandable. She had spent years supporting Charles and serving within his reign. If arrangements had been made to protect her after him, she could argue that those arrangements represented recognition of her service rather than an attempt to compete with William. But Anne reportedly looked at the issue differently. Service could be honored. Personal security could be considered. Private accommodation could be arranged. None of those things automatically created authority over the next monarch. That was reportedly the line Anne drew. And once she drew it, the earlier documents became much harder to interpret as harmless paperwork. The phrase about continuation beyond the present sovereign suddenly carried greater weight. It suggested that someone had been thinking about how elements of Camilla's existing structure could survive the transition. Anne reportedly asked a simple question: who would those arrangements ultimately answer to? There was reportedly no immediate answer. If Camilla's household continued independently, William could inherit the crown, while another royal office continued operating nearby. Staff might have old loyalties. Officials might face conflicting expectations. People outside the palace could struggle to understand which household represented the future of the monarchy and which represented the past. Anne reportedly understood the danger because she had spent decades watching the institution evolve. She did not need to accuse Camilla of building a rival court. The structure itself could create the problem. That was the argument. And it reportedly placed Camilla in an increasingly difficult position. If she insisted that every arrangement continue, critics could interpret it as an attempt to preserve influence. If she accepted the limits, she would be accepting that the position she held beside Charles had an endpoint. Neither choice was comfortable. Then came the question of the title itself. According to the account, Anne reportedly confirmed that the authority attached to Camilla's role as queen would end with the reign that created it, unless the incoming sovereign specifically renewed any element of that position. That was the moment the headline took on its full meaning. Camilla had not simply been confronted with a rumor about her future. She was reportedly being told that the future had already been defined by rules that existed before this meeting. The distinction mattered because it removed the possibility of blaming one person for the entire outcome. William could not simply be accused of inventing the restriction. Catherine could not simply be portrayed as demanding Camilla's removal. Anne was not reportedly announcing a personal punishment, and Charles was facing the uncomfortable reality that the framework had emerged during his own reign. That left Camilla confronting the institution itself. Her reported response was forceful. She questioned why years of service should suddenly become irrelevant at the moment the crown moved to the next generation. She reportedly challenged the idea that protecting her after Charles should be treated as a threat to William. Those objections had emotional force. But the advisors reportedly returned to the same principle. The next reign could respect the previous one without being governed by it. That sentence became the heart of the dispute, and it reportedly carried consequences far beyond Camilla. If the palace created an exception for her, Future royal households could point to that exception. Other former senior royals could demand similar arrangements. Staff could argue that old commitments remained valid. Public funding and security could become subjects of renewed controversy. The palace therefore had another reason to insist on clarity. Anne reportedly made that point without turning the meeting into a personal attack. She understood that royal disputes become dangerous when personal feelings are allowed to define institutional rules. Camilla reportedly disagreed. She believed the palace was using technical language to erase the significance of her years beside Charles. That disagreement exposed the emotional core of the story. For Camilla, the title represented a long journey. For the palace, the title represented a function. Those two meanings were now colliding. Then Charles reportedly intervened. He questioned whether the palace could not find a compromise that protected Camilla without creating a competing household. The proposal would have allowed continued dignity, appropriate support, and limited arrangements after the transition. For a moment, the pressure reportedly eased. But William's side allegedly rejected any wording that could allow those protections to become an unofficial source of authority. That was the problem with vague promises. A promise made privately could become an expectation publicly. An expectation could become a demand, and a demand could eventually become a constitutional dispute. Anne reportedly supported the need for precise language. No automatic continuation. No inherited authority. No assumption that staff, appointments, or ceremonial precedents would follow Camilla into the next reign simply because they existed during Charles's. Then the conversation reportedly reached its most uncomfortable point. Camilla asked whether this meant the monarchy had already decided that her role would disappear. Anne's answer, according to the account, was not emotional. The role belonged to the reign. When the reign ended, the authority attached to that role ended with it. That was the confirmation. It was the line that transformed the controversy from speculation into the central question surrounding the meeting. But Anne reportedly did not stop there. She pointed toward the document that had started the review. The authorization connected to Charles remained inside the file. That meant the king could not simply claim that William had created a new restriction against his wife. The framework had already been approved, and that left Charles facing a choice. He could challenge his own framework to protect Camilla, or he could accept that the rules he had supported would apply to the person closest to him. The room reportedly fell silent again. Camilla looked toward Charles. This time, the question was no longer directed at Anne. It was directed at her husband. Did he know what he had signed? And if he had known, why had he allowed the palace to reach this point? That question reportedly changed Charles's expression. Because the next document was not about William. It was not about Anne. It was not even about Camilla's household. It was connected directly to the king's own authorization. And once that document was opened, the entire confrontation reportedly took another turn. Before that page was read, however, there was one final detail Anne allegedly confirmed. The decision was already inside the succession framework. It did not need a fresh announcement. It did not need a dramatic vote. It did not need Camilla's permission. And that meant the question was no longer whether the decision would happen. The question was whether Charles would try to stop it. That question would not disappear now. If that answer matters to you, do not scroll away now, because the next part reportedly exposes the document that could show whether Charles misunderstood the consequences or knew exactly what he was signing. The final page reportedly changed the meaning of everything that came before it. Charles was no longer looking at a policy in the abstract. He was looking at the consequence of his own authorization, and according to the account behind this story, that consequence was now sitting directly between him and Camilla. The document reportedly made one principle unmistakable: authority connected to an active royal role would end when that role ended unless the incoming sovereign deliberately renewed it. That meant Camilla could be respected, protected, and supported without automatically carrying the authority of the Queen into William's reign. For Camilla, that distinction was devastating. The title represented years of public hostility, private pressure, and a long struggle to find an accepted place beside Charles. Now, the palace was reportedly telling her that the institution could recognize her service while refusing to carry her authority into the next reign. Then Charles was reportedly asked the question that nobody wanted to answer. Had he understood the consequences when he approved the framework? The account suggests that his answer was not immediate. That silence mattered. If Charles had misunderstood the language, then the king had approved a reform without fully appreciating what it could mean for his wife. If he had understood it, then the situation was even more uncomfortable. It would mean he had accepted a framework knowing that Camilla's authority could eventually end with his reign. Camilla reportedly wanted Charles to challenge the decision. She wanted him to insist that her service deserved special treatment. She wanted him to use his position as king and husband to stop the process before it became irreversible. But the palace had another problem. The framework was already part of the succession planning. It had reportedly been circulated among officials. It had been considered by advisors. It had been incorporated into preparations for the next reign. Any attempt to create a private exception would therefore leave a record. That made a quiet reversal almost impossible. William reportedly understood this. He did not need to personally remove Camilla from the monarchy. He only needed to insist that the existing rules be applied consistently. That distinction gave the dispute its force. It was about whether the next sovereign should inherit obligations created by the previous sovereign without being allowed to change them. Catherine reportedly supported that principle. Her concern was the same one that had appeared earlier in the review. A former queen could be treated with respect without retaining a separate source of institutional authority. That position exposed the personal cost. Camilla could not easily separate the role from the woman who had lived through it. The palace could. That difference reportedly left her isolated. Then Anne reportedly delivered the point that became the clearest confirmation of all. The authority of Camilla's current role could not automatically survive the transition. In practical terms, that meant no automatic continuation of a separate household, no inherited authority over future appointments, and no assumption that privileges attached to the reigning queen would continue simply because Charles had once granted them. That was the moment the title became more complicated than the headline. The reported story was not about a ceremonial label. It was about power. Who controls staff? Who controls access? Who determines official duties? Who speaks with institutional authority? Who decides what happens after the reign ends? Those questions had been answered. But one question remained. Who had pushed the palace toward this confrontation in the first place? The account suggests that one final attachment contained details about proposed appointments, accommodation, and protection for people connected to her future. The document reportedly raised concerns because it appeared to preserve influence beyond Charles's reign. That detail matters because it could change the interpretation of the entire dispute. If Camilla personally ordered those arrangements, then the palace could argue that the restrictions were necessary to prevent her household from carrying influence into the next reign. If she did not, then someone close to her may have been acting independently. If that person believed they were protecting Camilla, the controversy may have grown from an attempt to help her. That is where the story becomes more complicated. Camilla reportedly left the meeting without receiving the answer she wanted. Charles remained trapped between the framework he had approved and the wife he had spent years defending. William left with the succession structure intact. Catherine left, knowing her question had been answered. Anne remained the figure who had reportedly confirmed the principle. Nothing about the outcome needed to look dramatic from outside the palace. There was no public confrontation, no angry announcement, no visible collapse of the monarchy. The changes were reportedly contained inside paperwork and future planning. But those are exactly the changes that can matter most inside an institution. Once staff are told who they answer to and privileges are separated from active duty, the practical reality changes, even if public language remains careful. That is why the phrase, "stripped of her royal title," carries such force in this story. The deeper issue is the stripping away of automatic authority. And that could be more consequential than a simple change in wording. Camilla's public image could remain. Her personal connection to Charles could remain. Her years of service could remain part of the record. But the institutional power attached to the reigning queen could reportedly stop at the moment the reign itself stopped. That is the line Anne allegedly confirmed. And that is why the story does not end with Camilla. It ends with Charles. Because the unresolved question is not simply whether William wanted this outcome, it is whether Charles knew that his own reform could produce it. If he did not know, then his failure was one of oversight. If he did know, then the silence becomes much harder to explain. Either way, Camilla was reportedly left facing a future she believed Charles would protect her from. And the final mystery may be even more important. Who was behind the requests that pushed the palace to examine her future so aggressively? Was someone acting for Camilla? Was someone trying to protect a member of her family? Or was the palace already preparing for a conflict that Camilla herself never intended to create? The reported existence of that final attachment leaves the story open. It suggests that the title controversy may have been only the visible part of a much larger argument about access, influence, and the people who expected to remain close to the center of royal power after Charles. That is why Princess Anne's alleged confirmation matters. She reportedly gave the institution's answer. The present role belonged to the present reign. The next reign would decide what came after it. And if that principle is applied consistently, then Camilla was not the only person whose future arrangements could be affected. Everyone connected to the old structure would have to face the same question. What survives when the sovereign changes? That question will remain at the center of the controversy, because the documents reportedly point to a decision that was already moving before the public ever heard about it. And if the allegations surrounding that final attachment are accurate, the person whose future may matter next has not even been fully identified. So if you believe royal power should never be allowed to disappear behind closed doors, do not simply watch this story and move on. Like this video, share it with someone who follows the monarchy, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications, because staying silent allows these controversies to vanish without scrutiny. And the next video on this channel is about to reveal the part that makes this entire situation even worse and far more interesting.